Hi, given the ongoing interest in Mali and the fact that for some strange reason my Mali videos keep doing really well, I thought it would be really great to bring on board really one of the Mali experts, at least inside the Washington, D.C. Beltway. I mean, there's a small number of us in Washington, D.C. who are long-term Mali watchers. And there are a few whose expertise is much greater than mine and whose opinions on basically all matters Mali I very happily defer to. And so one of them is Andrew Lebovich, whom I've been working with and talking to about Mali for, I don't know, 15 years now. I think we've done conference tables and panels together and all sorts of things. So I thought that it was sort of a no-brainer to come on and pick your brain rather than to be relying on my own knowledge. Andrew, thank you very much for coming on board. Would you like to introduce yourself? What do you do? Whom do you work for?
Sure. Well, thanks for having me, Michael. Though it's God, it really has been a long time that we've been following this and working on it. So, my name is Andrew Lebovich. I'm a research fellow with Cleandale Institute, but based here in Washington, D.C., and I cover a variety of different issues related to the Sahel and North Africa, but particularly armed groups, political geopolitical dynamics, and I wrote a dissertation on Muslim reformism in Algeria, Senegal, and Mali in the 20th century. So I've approached these issues from a number of different angles over the years.
Yeah, I remember when we started working together, I was shocked to learn that you were even still in graduate school. Like I thought, like, wait a minute, because you've got the authority of somebody who's like done the PhD and moved on and been working on this for decades. Like, wait, you're just in graduate school? Holy crap. So I thought, Andrew, if you'll bear with me today, what I wanted to do is to ask some really big ticket questions that I'm bringing up here. And I think that in the videos that I've done, I've already done what I could to give a good background as to what happened, what's going on, who are the players. So with you, I want to talk like big things, like very basic question, even just for starters. And here's this for starters: Is JNIM winning?
It's a good question. I think it's hard to put it just in terms of winning or losing, but certainly JNIM is advancing right now. They're advancing, they're adapting some of their tactics and strategies. They are obviously seeking out new alliances, new partnerships, and they are increasingly putting pressure on the actual functioning of the Malian government to the point of, in the attacks across Mali that we saw on April 25th, to the point of actually threatening leadership decapitation, to use the political science term for this. The fact that they were able to successfully target the Minister of Defense, Sadiq Kumara, that they came fairly close to being able to target the head of state, Assimi Goïta, and that they were able to almost disrupt the actual kind of governing structures of Mali is a really significant thing and a significant advancement and a dramatic escalation in this insurgency that has been going on for more than a decade at this point. People sometimes date the start of the insurgency to 2012, to the Tuareg Rebellion. Of course, it goes back much further, as you well know. So this has been an
Right.
ongoing evolution. I think we can't really say that they're winning per se, but they're certainly continue to advance.
Okay. So in other words, because you're avoiding saying that they're winning or that they've won, which means that you think that the game's not over. That strategically speaking, it's not over. Things could turn around in one way or the other.
I think we're at a point where it's not fair to call this a status quo. Obviously, even before April 25th, it wasn't fair to call it a status quo because the security situation kept getting worse in a lot of ways. But I think it's also not the reason I'm avoiding using the kind of binary term is not only because for now the Malian government has been able to show actually some significant resilience in the face of this really dramatic pressure, but that also JNIM has not been able to put forward a direct kind of governing alternative, which raises the question, and I don't want to preempt some of the discussion, but it raises the ultimate question of,
Yeah.
well, what does JNIM actually want to accomplish? And that's actually the reason why I'm hesitant to put this only in terms of kind of winning or losing, because I think there are some intermediate steps in there, and it's much more complicated, I think, than just this winning or losing question, particularly because, if you think that JNIM is trying to only supplant the state, then they haven't done that yet. And if you don't think that JNIM is trying to supplant the state, which is where my position falls, then certainly, again, they're advancing. They're putting aspects of the state at risk, but then they're not strictly winning in those terms either. They're definitely not losing.
Okay.
They're
I
definitely not
mean,
losing, but they're not winning per se.
so In my effort to think this through, and I've done this a lot actually, frankly, for clients, like they want to know like what's going on. And I say that ultimately the answer of whether they're, it sounds like we're on the same track here. The answer of whether they're, well, I think I differ in that I would say that they're winning for the reason that I believe that they have the initiative and that they're the ones who have the foot on the gas. They determine what happens and when. And the Malian government is purely reactive. That's the way I see it. And so from a strategic point of view, I feel like it is checkmate, just because no matter what the Malians can do, I don't see how they can change the situation so that they can get out of checkmate, get out of check, and turn things around. So ultimately, they are having to do what JNM wants them to do, which means whatever JNM wants, government's going to have to do, or Mali's going to have to do. And the lack of clarity here has to do with the fact that it's just not clear what they actually want, right? So if they don't want to topple the government, then what do they actually want to do, if that makes any sense? This is not the scenario where they're going to drive into Bamako, like Saigon or Havana, right? And they're going to drive in and they're going to like take down the flag and they're going to put up a new flag. And then there'll be these dramatic scenes of the regime like lifting off in helicopters, although maybe Russian helicopters, escaping and said that there's a whole new regime in place. If that's not what this is going to look like, then what is it going to look like?
So the truth is that we don't know what it's going to look like yet. And there are a couple of things that have happened since April 25th and even since last year that have demonstrated, on the one hand, that JNIM is able to exert a lot of pressure on the government, that they're able to take the initiative, as you described it, but that they can't necessarily push it as far as they might like for several reasons. But I think we shouldn't underestimate or under the limitations on JNIM activity as well. So JNIM has a lot of firepower. They have a lot of fighters. At the moment, they seem relatively flush with cash because of the ransom payment last year, in particular for a senior Emirati hostage who was taken captive outside of Bamako. But at the same time, there are still significant internal pressures within JNIM. There are, let's say, different groups of fighters, different commanders, different incentives. And so even when the group can operate in a more cohesive way, there are still those kind of fissures that do put pressure on the activities of the group internally. So one of the things that we saw, for instance, last year with the fuel blockade around Bamako was that blockade was difficult to maintain. It was difficult to maintain the fighters in place to actually keep up that pressure, even though JNIM was able to destroy a pretty significant number of fuel trucks. They were able to really restrict fuel access in Bamako for a time. But they also worked relatively quickly to put truces in place in exchange for basically the release of prisoners, but also for JNIM to be able to pull back some of their fighters from maintaining that blockade, because it's complicated, expensive, logistically difficult to actually maintain a blockade of a city like Bamako, which is a large city with several million inhabitants in Bamako and in the sort of outlying areas.
That's a whole take I've not heard before, which I appreciate. I mean, what my understanding of it was different, which doesn't mean my understanding is correct. My understanding of it was that, yes, they did the truces, but it was more not because they needed relief on their own side, right? Because they're struggling to maintain it, but just because they liked what they were getting. They were squeezing the government to make various concessions. And that's why they were doing the truces. I also have indications that they don't want to cause too much pain to the civilians. So they wanted to moderate, but still have the apparatus in place where they could tighten the blockade at will or loosen it at will. And meanwhile, they're using it to extort out of the government whatever that they wanted or thought that they needed at the time.
I think it can be a couple of different factors, right? So I don't think moderation, at least moderation is not the term that I would use to refer to how JNIM relates to civilians. Okay. They've certainly tried tactically and strategically over the years to shift how they interact with civilian populations in some cases. Certainly they have messaged, including after the 25th April attacks, that they do not want to attack civilians, that they want to avoid civilian harm. That's true in some cases and not true in others. JNIM has in some cases avoiding putting in place more punishing conditions for some civilians, but in central Mali, for instance, they've applied an enormous amount of pressure to civilian communities that were either seen as siding with militias or with the Malian army and Malian government, or just communities that were hesitant to sign on to these what are often termed kind of local peace accords, but are really also their own sort of negotiated truces. in many ways with communities, or where communities did not want to abide by all of the rules put in place by JNIM. And so in those cases, they have sometimes emptied villages of civilians. They have targeted civilians accused of collaborating with the armed forces. So even if, for instance, if we look at the Human Rights Watch report, the recent Human Rights Watch report that found that civilian casualties from government initiatives or from Russian attacks were much higher than those by JNIM, that doesn't mean that JNIM spares civilians. It means that they've taken a different.
These are no angels.
It just means that they've taken a different approach to civilians that has evolved over the years and has sometimes shown the group being somewhat more accommodating to some civilian communities. And in Bamako, again, just to sort of nuance this a bit further, some of it might be that they truly don't want to exact punishment on civilian communities because they're trying to, let's say, win hearts and minds or whatever you want to call it. Some of it is also that given how large and unruly Bamako is, it's also fair to say that they may not want to get entangled too much in dealing with civilians in or around Bamako itself, because that also poses a number of risks for the group if they get too kind of enmeshed in trying to deal with parts of Bamako itself beyond kind of slow infiltration or attacks. Because certainly JNIM has had a presence around Bamako, at times very discreetly in Bamako, in preparation for attacks in the capital and for other activities, let's say. But that's not the same thing as necessarily wanting to have their fighters patrolling or more directly engaging with civilians in Bamako itself. So one of the interesting things about this blockade is that in the period right after the attacks on April 25th, there were certainly reports of, JNIM was present in parts of Bamako. There were reports of JNIM fighters being seen in some of the southern neighborhoods of Bamako. Certainly they were also in Kati to the north of the city, patrolling quite openly. But at the same time, where the blockade is set up is it appears to be around kind of 50, 60, 70 kilometers outside of the city on different roads. And some of the main roads in and out of the capital. I suspect that at least one of the reasons for that, I think, is to avoid being attacked easily by Malian forces or by Russian forces. But I suspect that part of that is also that they wanted to exert some control over their own fighters. And again, to avoid the risk of them kind of running through different neighborhoods in Bamako, potentially causing damage, causing problems. So yes, they're clearly trying to exert some control over their fighters. They're trying to avoid some incidents with civilians. But the reason I don't like to use the term moderation for that is that I think that's a tactical decision to try to preserve aspects of their image and the image that they're trying to put forward. But it's not really a moderation per se.
But to me, any instance that I might see moderation, I don't see it as kindness. I see it simply as a calculated policy. It serves a purpose. They're coming up with a strategy of how best to achieve what they want to achieve. Sometimes it means you slit everybody's throats, and sometimes it means that you're nice to them. You give them free sheep or something. I don't know what, but it's not kindness. It's just calculated. It's my understanding of it.
Sure, I think that's reasonable. I will say there's something I meant to add earlier in terms of the pressure on the group or not. One of the factors, I think, in wanting to seek out some of those truces around the fuel blockade was also, of course, pressure from the Islamic State. And I think there's still some concern that if fighting kicks off again with the Islamic State, as it did in the past, as it did late last year, that would also pose a threat to JNIM being able to maintain something, again, that's very resource heavy, like a blockade.
They can't do the two things at once.
I think it's harder for them to do two things at once.
Harder.
And I think we also forget sometimes that JNIM has a significant number of these blockades all across the region. So there are a number of kind of village level blockades or commune level blockades in parts of central and northern Mali, in parts of southern Mali, in parts of Burkina Faso. So that's also something that, again, they don't always have to maintain it with a significant number of personnel, but these are all things that they have to maintain. So that's another reason to try to seek out these local arrangements or truces when possible, is also just to free up fighters for other things.
I feel like we keep dancing around the question of what do they want? What's their end game here?
So what are their objectives? I think that's the question that a lot of governments and certainly researchers are asking at the moment. And it's a subject of some disagreement, right? And one of the reasons it's subject of disagreement is is the Syria question that a lot of people have been raising since Harakat Tahrir al-Sham assumed governance or took over governance in Syria at the end of 2024. I'm not a Syria expert, but so people have at least been asking the question of, is JNIM going to pursue an HTS style approach? So breaking with Al-Qaeda and
This is
seeking to
the
actually,
what? This is the
I don't think it's necessarily his thesis. You'd have to ask Wassim for
no,
for
no,
a
no.
more
He's not saying
specific
this
view of
is
his
happening. He's
thesis.
saying it might be. He's saying it might be
Yeah.
happening.
Yeah, the
That's what he
Wassim,
points to.
so Wassim has done, I think, some of the best close analysis and reporting about what that might look like and what
Hmm.
some of the indications of this might be. Though even in Wassim's really excellent interview that he just did with the CTC Sentinel about Mali, he also talked about some of the nuance and some of the ways in which JNIM is not following an HTS path. Jason Warner has also done some really good writing on this. And so there's a lot of nuance, but that is one of the things that people are looking at is essentially, is JNIM trying to take over the country? My personal interpretation, at least for the moment, is that that's not their goal. And I think there are others who share this view that what I think JNIM was looking for was to at least create such a sort of cataclysmic shift in the government, either to force the government to change from an internal coup or from a kind of uprising toward a civilian transition, or to create so much change within the current government in Mali that they would be open to either negotiations with JNIM or to really kind of pulling back on their presence to allow JNIM a lot of free reign throughout the rest of the country, parts of central Mali and parts of northern Mali, and then certainly around the border areas. So that's what I think the goal was, at least in the short term. For the longer term, of course, that becomes a bit murkier because JNIM has said that their goal is still the sort of governance by the Sharia, whether that's JNIM governance or someone else governing according to Sharia. And at this point, JNIM has been pretty unclear. I think intentionally vague in terms of what their actual end state is. I am not convinced that JNIM's ultimate goal is to sort of actually govern the state from Bamako. I don't really think that JNIM has given any indication that their goal is to have a power sharing agreement or to sort of sit in ministries and have that sort of a
Hmm.
formal governing role. And that doesn't mean that JNIM is not a governing actor or a political actor. They are. They are very politically astute. They are involved in forms of governance in different parts of the country where they're predominant. And Ivan Gishawa and Feroz Bouhlal wrote a very good piece about zakat as sort of so taxation as a form of state making and governance. But at the same time, that's a very different view of the state than a kind of Westphalian state governance model that I think we can say HTS very much assumed that state-based Westphalian model, obviously with their own interpretations, but they have assumed the mechanics and the infrastructures of state. And they did that very intentionally, and they did that over a years-long period. JNIM hasn't pursued that path. And it doesn't mean that they're not interested in exerting pressure and eventually could evolve into a governing role that is closer to what we would understand as governance in this state-focused way. But right now, that's not really what they're doing. Again, it doesn't mean they're not engaged in politics, and it doesn't mean they're not governing in some ways, but they're governing in different ways and in a fairly limited way that in some ways recalls more of the kind of pre-colonial state models, particularly some of the jihad states that were active in Mali and West Africa in the 18th and 19th centuries. So there are other kind of parallels or
Right.
comparisons to be drawn. I think the Syria comparison and even the Afghanistan comparison is limited in a number of ways. And I also think that one of the other things that we forget sometimes is that the predecessor groups, or the groups that formed JNIM, had an experience of territorial governance that was very complicated for them in 2012 and did not end very well for them. So it sort of ended in the French intervention in Operation Serval in early 2013. But even before then, it was a complicated process for them to try to govern northern Mali. And northern Mali, where the population centers are smaller than in the rest of the country, and where even then, in the areas where they faced opposition, they faced sometimes significant opposition, even if they were relatively better accepted in some cases than the the Tuareg, the largely Tuareg movement, the MNLA, but they still were not fully accepted. It was a very difficult process to try to manage relations with civilian populations, to manage relations with other armed groups. All of that was very difficult for them. And then it ended in a significant amount of death and destruction, which they were able to come back from and rebuild from. But it was still a very difficult, very costly process. And I don't believe that JNIM and certainly the leaders of JNIM have forgotten.
Maybe what we're seeing is the emergence of some sort of new kind of hybrid form of governance, wherein the government in Bamako, the state government, the official legally recognized one that has representatives at the UN, is largely irrelevant on the ground. Or maybe its relevance is limited to the boundaries of the municipality of Bamako and a few other areas, maybe. But they're relevant for the vast majority of people out in the countryside. It's still a fairly rural population. And there could be some sort of strange modus vivendi between the two, where there's the de facto ruler and then the de jure ruler that sits enthroned in Bamako and does its thing. It does remind me, I mean, I'd have to learn more about also the governance of the 19th century governments, like the Tukulur Empire and the Messina Empire and the Emirates, like in what ways what we're seeing now might resemble that. But it's definitely feels like the emergence of something other than this classic European Westphalian notion we have of nation states in favor of something else, something that does feel more like the pre-colonial states, perhaps.
Yeah, I think certainly
But
JNIM and Ketiba Messina has drawn some inspiration from the Dina, from the Messina state.
yeah.
Again, it's not a perfect comparison, but I think we can look at some of those elements of particularly sort of mobile, lighter touch governance, let's say, as one inspiration for how JNIM certainly governs in some of the rural areas of Mali and how they might eventually try to govern in more urban areas. But I think we're still a ways off from that.
Okay. So maybe more, I'm trying to imagine, like in The Godfather, where you've got like a neighborhood in a city where the gang, the mafia, is the real rule. You pay taxes to the mafia. They're the ones who settle scores. They're the ones who settle disputes. And yeah, somewhere there's a municipality and there's a police and whatnot, but it's almost irrelevant for most people in terms of the day-to-day lived reality. So maybe there's like a weird bifurcation in that sense. It makes me want to look back. I know Georg Klute, the German anthropologist, has written about this concept of Parastaatlichkeit, the idea of some of these groups in Mali emerging as a parastate and taking on some of the roles of a government and acting in certain ways based on the fact that they have some certain kinds of rents. One question that I would want to pose to you has to do with part of what makes Mali complex is the geography of the place. It's easier to imagine the north being cut off, at least for me, not perhaps for Malians, but like the north being cut off and the north governing itself or not governing itself as it sees fit. I'm not really sure how the north would ever govern itself, but just doing its thing. Central Mali, maybe you could carve out some sort of new Dina 2.0. But the South is super complicated. So, right, and I can imagine the government kind of relinquishing the North and maybe some of the South because it doesn't have a choice. But the South is complicated. Among other things, a lot of the money's coming from the industrial mining companies that are in the South. And they're all the way in Kai region, up hard up against the Senegalese border, and to some extent the Guinean border. Who gets those? Like that to me would be a real plum. Is that what keeps the rump Malian state alive? Because you still have some control over Kai region and some control over the areas where the mining's going on, which means that all of that would be tolerated by JNIM? Or does JNIM take that away from the Malian state? And then to what effect?
I mean, I think it would be very it would be very complicated for them to take that away. Again, I think even understanding this as a kind of rump Malian state, I want to push back a little bit on that because yes, the state has had its presence very significantly reduced, but even I think the first issue is maybe with this very common shorthand, right, of the north, the center, the south, and that even though that can be a kind of rough, it can be a rough shorthand, but it's a continuum, right? So yes, you can look at population centers sort of decreasing as you go further north in Mali, certainly different kinds of communities and populations, but there isn't just a neat kind of dividing line that exists. We've seen that throughout contemporary Malian history. We saw it in 2012. There wasn't this strict division, right? And so that's one issue. But certainly, even we might get to a situation at some point as JNIM continues to advance in, say, Sikasso High, where they can start to apply more pressure to some of those industrial mines, to some of the other major industries, particularly cotton, in Mali. We may see that point, but again, I do still think we're a ways off, both because those industrial mines are pretty well protected. They are, for now, pretty removed from the areas where a lot of these attacks are concentrated. It's been interesting to see the extent to which the mining companies actually don't seem too concerned for the moment. I think in the background, there's certainly some noise where people are concerned, but at least in public, there's a bit of a business as usual tone for right now. I'm not sure if you've seen something different in conversations with mining people, but they're at least trying to.
They're concerned enough to be asking the likes of me what I think is going on, but with gold being what it is these days, that it's they're good to go.
Yeah, but so
I don't have that kind
but
of
this
risk
is
tolerance.
no, I mean, it is interesting to see that level of risk tolerance. But yeah, I think we might get to that point eventually, and certainly along the borders with Guinea and with Senegal and even Cote d'Ivoire, there's significant concern that that could start to really impact the economic lifeblood of the state, and that's a very
Right.
that's a very real concern. But the state does still have some capacity, particularly in the security forces, and this is a thing that you and I have discussed a bit, but this is not the Malian state and the Malian military of 2012. That doesn't mean that there aren't very real
Correct.
challenges. It doesn't mean that they necessarily would be in a position to, say, conquer the country as it stands right now. But the state has evolved over time. The military is in a larger and stronger position, in part because so much of the national budget has been devoted to these efforts at re-equipment and rearmament for the armed forces. So it just means that as JNIM has gotten stronger, the state also has gotten stronger in certain specific ways, certainly in the security forces. And that's part of why it's very hard for JNIM to deal that sort of final blow or the coup de grace for the government. I think they tried to an extent on April 25th, but it didn't quite work out that way. It might still happen, but I think now we're also seeing JNIM regrouping a bit and assessing what the next step is, in the same way that they regrouped after the attacks in Western Mali last July, the same way that they regrouped after the fuel blockade of Bamako had been going on for some time.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, when I look at what's going on now, first of all, it's clear to me that the Malian army of 2012 would not have survived the attacks of 25 April. It just would not have. It would have completely collapsed. It has not collapsed, and to their credit. And my understanding is that these things reflect the resilience of the Malian military ultimately reflects better leadership and higher morale. And these things are related because you need better leaders to attend to the morale. And I also tend to think you have to give credit where credit's due, and that President Goita and now the late Minister of Defense Sadio Kamara, they have credit. They should take credit for that because they attended to things better than the predecessor did, IBK, the president. As much as I hate to say it, I hate to say that these putschists have done a better job as the elected president, but in this regard, they really have. Just attending to the war effort and attending to the military, and it's a better, stronger, more resilient place, more resilient military. So I am impressed that they haven't collapsed. And the retreats that I've seen since April 25th have been strategic retreats, like orderly retreats, things that they needed to do because they were in untenable positions. So they've left the untenable positions, as opposed to everybody just fleeing, like grabbing their stuff and running off into the desert, which we've seen in the past. It's more of a 2012 sort of activity. What if we extend to the region, which is interesting. Like, we can talk about what they want in Mali, what they want to achieve in Mali, but we also have JNIM. They're active in many other places. I mean, they have elements in Senegal, at least near the border. They have elements in Guinea near the border. I'm going to guess they have in Cote d'Ivoire, but it's so far so good in Cote d'Ivoire. There's an active hot fight going on in Benin and Togo. Not so much Ghana, but the threat is there. They control a large portion of Burkina Faso. And you have to wonder when things will kick off in Senegal. You have to wonder if things are going to kick off in Guinea. And of course, Mauritania is right there. So this clearly is more than just the Malian thing. They have some sort of regional ambition. What does that look like? What do they want? What's the ambition here?
I don't necessarily think they know from the central perspective. So this is where, on the one hand, there's clearly been a plan for a number of years to expand, including expansion into some of the coastal states. But if you look at, for instance, the most recent International Crisis Group report, they did a nice job of demonstrating the fact that the expansion has not always been driven purely by central decision making within the sort of ruling shura of JNIM. And this is something that that I and others have observed for a number of years in looking at conflict in these border areas in particular, that the fighters also have a say. And one of the drivers of expansion is also the recruitment of people from some of these border areas where, as fighters, as communities in some cases, either seek out JNIM's help or send some of their sons to join JNIM, then they also are able to exert some pressure on the group to expand their activities, their military activities, I should say, in some of these areas. So it's a bit of a kind of push-pull thing, as I think about it at least, where it's not just a purely centralized decision-making process or strategy. And this is, again, something that people have seen with Sahelian militant groups, and I'm sure also in other insurgencies going back for years, that the fighters also are able to make their own feelings known and to exert some pressure in certain cases on their commanders, and that also the commanders and central organization are also responsive to the fighters when, for instance, there's a risk that, say, fighters might defect to other groups. In this case, to the Islamic State, but previously to other armed groups. And so that's also something that the commanders have to be responsive to, because obviously they don't want to lose important numbers of fighters to other groups, or they don't want to lose fighters who will just potentially go home at some point. So this is where it's not just a kind of planned out, orderly process for the expansion. Planned out in some cases, but it's also sometimes halting, sometimes ad hoc, sometimes they get drawn into some of these conflicts. So the crisis group report made the argument, for instance, that the Benin expansion, if I'm remembering correctly, and forgive me, crisis group, if I'm misstating the report, that the Benin expansion was partially driven by some of these dynamics, and that the central authority was actually not trying to expand into Benin so quickly. So that's just one example of how this process is not a clearly delineated process. And so there's at least some contingency that we see throughout this, and certainly I think it's fair to say at this point, for whatever reason, that JNIM has not tried to openly expand in Senegal, for instance. Clearly, if they wanted to conduct attacks in Mauritania, they could. But for some reason, they're choosing not to, for whatever reason. JNIM could be conducting attacks in Ghana, but they are choosing not to, right? So if you look at all the areas where JNIM is very present on one side of the border and not another, clearly the organization is making choices for whatever reason to not engage or to not engage openly. So even to take Nigeria, for instance, there was a JNIM presence in Nigeria before they announced their first operations in Nigeria. So those are intentional choices, very clearly. But we don't know exactly kind of what the plan is. We don't know exactly what JNIM wants. Dispute about this even in circles of people who are sort of close to JNIM, right? And I think this is in part because there almost certainly is not one unified view within JNIM of what to do in the coastal states, or even what to do in the Sahel, in the central Sahel.
Right. I've heard it explained in terms of an interest in lines of communication to the water. They're not interested in the littoral countries per se. They're really more interested in the central Sahel. But they also understand that in order for any kind of polity to thrive in the central Sahel, Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, you need access, which means you have to have some sort of influence over the roads, the territory where the roads go, because the roads, in Mali's case, go through Senegal, Guinea, and Cote d'Ivoire. So there's some interest in having influence there, which doesn't necessarily mean you actually have to control the territory, you have to invade or conduct military operations, but it means some sort of presence. I'm not really sure what it means, but that's part of their thinking. So I've been told.
Maybe. I think maybe that's. I think that's a couple steps ahead of where we are right now. I think certainly JNIM, like the organizations that compose it that existed before JNIM, or say the organizations that formed JNIM, have had an interest in using some of the coastal states, even going back to the 2000s, as a place to rest and recuperate for some of their fighters and even commanders, a place to buy certain things that couldn't be bought as easily in the Sahel. So there is an interest, I think, in having access in some limited way.
Access, right, at the very least.
In the coastal states. I don't know if it's so well thought out that they want to, say, have specific road access or specific shipping access. I think that's a bit of an extrapolation, maybe speculation on what their goals might be. But certainly, like I said, I think there are intentional choices being made on the part of the JNIM leadership to maintain access in certain areas and to not conduct open attacks, not conduct operations in certain areas. Clearly is an intentional choice. There are multiple potential explanations for why they're making those choices, and I'm not in the room with the Shura, so I can't say why those choices are being made. But I think access to resources, access to supply chains is one potential part of that. And then I think there are other reasons that are military, sociological, all sorts of things.
So how worried should the neighbors be? How worried should Guinea be or Senegal?
I think it's not how worried they should be. They are worried. I think all of the coastal states,
Hmm.
to one extent or another, are very concerned. They don't necessarily have a good answer to what's going on, particularly because I think there's some fear that if the coastal states become too implicated, or some of the coastal states, I should say, if they become too implicated in, say, counterterrorism operations in the central Sahel, that would not only reinforce the juntas, but it would also put their own communities at risk and would potentially lead to attacks on their territory. So there's certainly a significant amount of concern, I think, in all of the coastal states about not just the advance of jihadist groups, but also the potential for state collapse in the central Sahel, and then what happens afterwards in terms of population outflows, refugee populations, and other forms of insecurity that are related to armed group violence, but aren't strictly spoken of in terms of just attacks on coastal territory.
Okay. So part of the problem, one of the things I wanted to ask you about was like, so what? Like, what if they win? But then that's complicated by the question that we don't know what winning looks like. So it's hard to imagine. But like, what are the plausible scenarios that go through your head? Plausible, not pie in the sky. I don't like the idea that it could be like Afghanistan where Al-Qaeda is going to stage attacks against the American homeland or anything like that. Plausible scenarios. What might this look like and so what?
So this is a hard question in part because like you, I don't like to speculate about these kind of war on terror, fever
Hmm.
dream scenarios about the Sahel.
Right,
That's
right, right.
not useful for anyone, and it's not helpful, I don't think. But we're looking, I think, at plausibly a lot of instability on borders in border areas that could eventually, if the militant scene in the Sahel has to adapt its tactics, decides to start conducting attacks, say, in coastal states, I think there is a risk to some of these mining operations. There's a risk to some of these supply chains and businesses where coastal states are very dependent on some of these economic enterprises,
Hmm.
agricultural production, mining facilities, all sorts of other things that could potentially be at risk as these groups continue to expand their operations. And then, of course, there's a very real humanitarian risk of displacement, not migration in the sense of the sort of European panic over migration, but certainly of regional populations in conflict spreading elsewhere. And then, as I said, there is this question, not so much of a kind of JNIM governed Malian state, but of what happens in a regional security or from a regional security standpoint if these groups find that they can't expand much further or much more easily, but then also have to fight for their own legitimacy with their fighters and with wider communities. And so that's where I think there's going to be a choice that these organizations face of essentially, do they shift toward less of an armed group model and more of a governing model? Or particularly in the case of the Islamic State, do they start conducting attacks in the region and even further afield? And again, that's not to sort of fearmonger on the prospect for the region being a staging ground for foreign attacks. That's not what I'm trying to say. But I do think that there is an increased risk of some of these regional plotting or armed group violence that could expand outward if they eventually find that they can't advance as easily and don't want to try to, say, enter a coalition government in different parts of the Sahel.
Okay. So we end up with
So
something where, again, not unlike pre-colonial states, where they need to keep expanding to survive, or even the Roman Empire, because you've got to give the fighters something to do, which means they need to be expanding, and because there's some extent there's booty involved, and if you would just stop and demobilize, you'd actually have to do other ways of governing and developing legitimacy, which they could do, but it would be a choice, a strategic choice that they would have
yeah,
to make.
it would be a choice and I think these organizations, so JNIM, the Islamic State Sahel province, are eventually going to have to make those choices. Either they're going to make those choices themselves, the choices are going to be forced on them a bit by the situation, but there's going to have to be a shift
Mm-hmm.
at some point in how these groups operate.
Okay. Will there at some point be a coming to terms between JNIM and Islamic State?
Sorry, I didn't hear.
like a coming to terms. At some point, is there going to be,
Uh,
right, like one of them will have to prevail somehow.
they
I
won't
mean,
necessarily have to
particularly in Mali,
fully.
they're always stepping on each other's toes in Mali.
Yeah, I think at various times there's been a bit of a modus vivendi. At other times, it's been really intense combat between them. So I don't think
Mhm.
necessarily one group absolutely has to win over the other. This is not a Highlander situation per se, where there can be only one. But I do think that certainly, as JNIM has tried at various times to at least tamp down conflict with ISSP, and
Mhm.
it has often been ISSP that has been really pushing at JNIM, particularly when JNIM was distracted elsewhere, as we saw during the fuel blockade last year. So there, I think this question of fighting between the two groups is going to have a really big impact, particularly on what JNIM does and the extent to which JNIM seeks out a kind of negotiated, not really negotiated solution, but a negotiated truce or some sort of temporary peace with regional governments, particularly with the Malian government, even though for the moment the Malian
Right.
government
'Cause that's something
has
that
made it clear
Islamic State
publicly
objects to.
that they're not interested. I don't think we can get back to what Henning Nasabia and Caleb Weiss called the Sahelian exception. I don't think we're really going to be able to get back to that per se, but JNIM has shown itself to be at least a little bit more conciliatory within limits toward the Islamic State than the Islamic State has been toward JNIM. Again, with very real limits and a lot of caveats in place, but I don't think we can get back to that real period of non-aggression between them. But there's a situation that can be imagined where they more or less stick to their own territories with some periodic fighting.
Mhm.
But the question is also going to be between JNIM and the FLA in the north.
You're right. I was going to
How
ask about that. How would that work?
So that's the question because the FLA has and different FLA leaders have said subtly different things about the nature of the partnership between them. So some of this is also depending on
Hmm.
who you're talking to, right? So if it's Al-Ghabas Agantala or if it's Bilal al-Sharif or if it's Mohammed Ramadan speaking in Paris, there are still subtly different explanations given, and I think at least for Bilal al-Sharif, the historic leader of the MNLA, he has talked about this as a kind of temporary alliance, one based on some commonality between them, particularly as they've tried to say that this question of the Sharia really isn't that big of a deal because this is something that is so the FLA has walked away from some of the avowed secularism of the MNLA, even though that was always more complicated than just the kind of secular image that was presented, particularly to a French audience. So it's always
Hmm.
been more complicated than that. But I do think that these groups are still very different and have different goals. And there's, maybe in Kidal, they can have a kind of governing arrangement that works well enough between them. But it's hard to imagine that this can sort of last forever without some form of fighting or without one group essentially being absorbed into the other. That's harder to imagine, particularly if this coalition or partnership is able to expand into, say, Timbuktu or even Gao. I don't think that's necessarily that likely
Hmm.
for now, but if it happens, then I think those divisions will become more apparent again.
Right. I don't see the FLA being able to hold on to Gao or to Timbuktu. I mean, with Gao, the MNLA briefly occupied it, and they didn't do so well. They weren't very popular, right? It created a lot of resistance. I think the farther away you get from Kidal, the harder it will be for the FLA to govern and to control without being challenged by somebody else, if that makes sense. Yeah. I want to just skip to the last question about the U.S. role. So, given the mess that obviously this is, what, if anything, should the United States and the rest of the West do about the situation? There's a question of what could it do, which is a very hard question to answer, anyways, at this point, and then what should it do? Because it's not clear to me that it could do anything or that it should do anything, because we've certainly tried to do a lot of things in the past which haven't really worked, have they? Your thoughts, like, policymakers came to you and said, all right, what do we do? Or should we do anything? What is your answer?
So people have been asking, and I don't have a good answer, unfortunately. I think that trying to seek out some form of limited cooperation where possible is one avenue. Obviously, continuing to observe the situation,
Hmm.
bolstering coastal states where needed, but moving away where possible from the kind of strict counterterrorism paradigm is one thing. I'm personally a bit skeptical for the moment about the prospect for dialogue and negotiations, but at the same time, I think they're necessary. And so, to the extent that it's possible to try to find avenues for discussion, avenues for dialogue, or at least encourage it between, say, regional governments and JNIM, even if the end result of that is that they don't really have common ground and they have to reformulate their approaches, I think that there's still some benefit in that approach. So I think certainly increasing cooperation with the coastal states, looking for avenues to cooperate where it doesn't compromise, say, American or European values, particularly in terms of how counterterrorism operations are prosecuted on the ground right now. It's going to be limited for some time. There isn't a huge margin for intervention, and I think we need to be honest about that fact. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't at least be looking for the opportunities and having an ongoing dialogue with the Sahelian states where possible, with the coastal states certainly, and then trying to find some of those areas of common ground between the coastal states and Sahelian states, and then with the Sahelian states themselves to try to gradually shift some of these more, let's say, risky approaches to dealing with armed violence to find a better solution. Because this is not a short-term problem. And there has been a lot of short-term thinking that's dominated, I think, European and American approaches to the region for a long time. So I'd say now is actually the time to step back a bit, but to try to take that medium and long-term approach to how we handle engagement, how we kind of fund regional initiatives, and how we talk to coastal states, certainly, and then the Sahelian states where possible.
I think I agree with you, given the sort of the excesses of the global war on terror and our approaches to these things over the past 20 years. This is a really good time to reflect, take a step back, which does also mean kind of not get involved, because until we can figure out a constructive way of getting involved, then maybe we shouldn't, right? It's like a do no harm kind of thing, maybe. This doesn't sound very satisfying, but
I don't think there's a satisfying answer. I mean, there's definitely no,
there's none.
So there's no solution. There's no one silver bullet that's going to fix this for everyone. But that requires, even if we're not actively engaging, that still requires a presence and monitoring and discussion. So all of those things still need to be happening. We can't just pull back completely and sort of expect things to sort themselves out.
Away.
So yeah, but it also doesn't mean that we should be jumping into counterterrorism operations or anything like that.
Drone strikes, that's the answer for everything, clearly.
Yeah, because clearly we've seen from the last 20 plus years of war on terrorism, the drone strikes just fix everything.
Absolutely, right. Which is why it's so great that we're still doing it in Somalia and a lot of other places. Okay, on that note, thank you very much. Thank you, Andrew, for taking the time. It's as enlightening as always. I learned a lot. And there are some minor points of disagreement, but when it comes out of your mouth, then that means that I have to think about it. And it's incumbent on me to okay, because you're probably right and I'm probably wrong. So I need to reassess and recalibrate, which is always good. And that's why
I wouldn't go that far, but
things.
I wouldn't go that. But it's always good to discuss and find points of commonality and disagreement.
Great. Well, thank you.
Thank you for having me.